Hello everyone, welcome back. In the last video, we talked about immersive technologies in education and why we should push towards them. And this video will talk about a little bit of the production milestones that you can see on a macro scale in as immersive technologies become more mainstream in education. And later we'll also talk about some of the state of the hardware and software and some challenges that will need to be solved there. So, to start with, this is something we see already happening a lot all over the world, which is like milestone zero, where you will see a lot of proof of concepts being made a minimum viable product with representative content, especially in the K-12 or vocational training areas. We see this happening a lot, and this phase will see us figuring out the tech challenges in AR, VR, and adapting it for education. And we'll also need to get comfortable building out more and more tools and content creation suites to build AR, VR content because this is a new kind of content, and traditional content creators are kind of at a loss at building this kind of content. So we will see more of this also happen. And once, while this is going on, like towards the latter half of this milestone, we will see us transition towards milestone one, which is now working closely with schools, educators, and so on to bring this content in front of the actual end users, the, the, the students themselves, and then work out some of the learning outcomes and how we are going to define the research hypothesis behind why we think our approach to immersive teaching will work and so on. This is also again something that we see happening in companies all over the world, or maybe companies, research teams, universities, so on, who are working in this space. The next milestone would be to expand. It's just building on the previous milestone, work with multiple schools, multiple teams, create a lot of courses, build out the entire portfolio, and also collect feedback and research data to make sure that our hypotheses are correct and that we are further making learning outcomes better. And yeah, also continue to solidify our tools for content creation. Finally, if you want to see real reach, you want to see this transition from a B2B, like a direct to school product, must change to a direct to students, directly in the hands of the consumers, a B2C product. And that's when we will see the real multiplier effect that this technology can have. And then finally, like you'll see like the more nebulous future milestones, which would be, taking whatever we have learned in this and bringing it to other things such as enterprise training, interior design, yeah, and so on. Okay, quickly changing gears and moving on. We will look at some of the technological challenges and opportunities that are present in this space. Before we do that, we'll take a quick short detour, look at a little bit of the history of this field and how it has grown in the last 30 years. So, over the last 30 years, pretty much as soon as we've been able to develop computers with a somewhat decently small form factor, we've been obsessed with creating more and more sensory immersion in the experience that the computer delivers to us. And these were some of the early attempts at something like virtual reality, right? But the computer graphics of the time, the processing power of the time, was just not enough, and yet we have been trying. Some serious attempts started to happen again, being uh, the vanguard being the games and entertainment industry. These are some of the early attempts at what we today recognize pretty much as early AR and VR attempts. They were all in the space of games and game systems and entertainment. And again, the processing power of the time, the graphics of the time were simply not enough to deliver the kind of compelling experience that humans want. So these attempts, while they failed, they paved the way for resurgence of the same experiments a little while later, and people kept trying until finally in 2012, like pretty much all of the challenges were solved to enough of a degree that the form factor and the performance and everything, the battery life, everything came together to be an acceptable consumer product, the Oculus. And ever since then, like we've been making the rapid progress because now that we have figured out how to get this to the hands of consumers, we now have a direct publicly funded research project, right? If you think of it like that. And then we have had an explosion in the technology and the number of products that we have in this space. And yeah, so it is still quite early stages, but we've made enough progress in the last like, decade, and it seems very promising to expect that this is going to continue, especially given that some major players are pouring serious money into this. You know, you must have heard that Facebook is planning to put in $10 billion, hire 10,000 people across Europe, and so on. That is some serious investment. So that has to show up in the hands of consumers somehow, right? Like in terms of new cutting edge research, in terms of new ways, new platforms for media creation, media sharing, and so on. Okay, this is where we are with the technologies. Now, taking a slightly more zoomed out approach, the while this whole technological innovation is happening, the technologies and the constraints and the opportunities, we can divide them into like the following uh, categories, I guess. Here I'm mostly focusing on the hardware side of things, but many of these also have software-led solutions. So the first thing, the first few here are partially solved or on the verge of being, fully solved, uh, or at least they're at an acceptable level for VR to be in the hands of consumers today. And the lower down we go on this, the less the technology has been solved. So starting with stereoscopic 3D, we all know how the human eye sees 3D, right? This is a very basic concept. We have known this for many decades on how to make computers do this, which is basically it's to create parallax effect. The left eye and the right eye see slightly different images because they're a slightly different point of view, even if it's just 2 or 3 inches apart. And yeah, the brain can figure out the distance to an object based on the difference between the images sent by the left and right eye. So this is easy, this kind of binocular vision. We've been simulating this in computers and viewfinders and all these for a long time now. However, there is a few issues with this kind of stereoscopic 3D. We'll come back to this actually in a later section. But for now, let's just say the stereoscopic 3D that we can achieve in even like the cheapest of headsets is acceptable enough that consumers are able to, immerse themselves in the experience, stay in the experience for extended periods of time. The next important thing being head tracking. Obviously, we started out with 3 degrees of freedom. So uh, we actually started out with rotational head tracking, and then very quickly we added the other 3 degrees, which is positional. So you move your head and the thing moves, and then we just needed to add the same kind of head tracking that you would expect in real life. So basically, reducing the latency and so on. So three considerations: form factor. So the the head tracking apparatus can't be too bulky or too heavy, or it feels constraining, and it has to have very good accuracy and it has to have low latency. Most of these things are already kind of solved today to a very acceptable level. We started with wall-mounted sensors, which was form factor wise, this was quite bulky, quite tedious to set up and so on. But today, most, if not all, VR headsets have transitioned to outside in, inside out tracking. This all mounted will be outside in. So we have moved to inside out tracking where you just have cameras mounted on the displays, on the head mounts themselves, and they use visual cues from just the room around you or some other static objects to figure out the 6 degrees of freedom, your position and your rotation. And this is working extremely well, and the latency is very low, the accuracy is good enough as well. So you can treat this problem almost as completely solved. The next comes hand tracking, right? Because uh, this is very important to humans. We have this sense of um, where our hands are in our environment. We always know this, and it is very important that this be represented very accurately. And also, this is how we primarily interact with our environment. So, hand presence and gesture and finger tracking would be the two important components of this. And hand tracking is kind of okay, like partially solved using just controllers that have sensors on them and inside out, outside in tracking, whatever. Right? It's easy to do hand presence, but hand presence with gesture and finger tracking is still a problem that needs to be solved. Different companies, different products have taken different approaches, like pressure sensitive controllers, gloves, smarty gloves, haptic gloves, or just using cameras. A lot of AI led image processing to figure out the hand position. This is a problem that is actively being worked on, but probably in the next like 4 to 5 years, we will see this problem solved adequately enough that consumers will have absolutely no trouble using hands to interact with their virtual environments. The next thing that doesn't often get talked about a lot is spatial audio. And very similar to binocular vision, spatial audio works in the same way, except instead of different images, it is a delay in the sound perceived by one ear or the other based on the distance to uh, the source of the sound. Delay and also, the volume or the intensity of the sound itself. This problem again very similar to binocular vision. It's easy to solve using just two speakers and two channels of audio information being related to that. And you could even go as far as having a complete surround audio setup. Mm. This problem is again, other than for audio files for most normal consumers, this problem is already adequately solved. And yeah, with just general advancements in audio reproduction technology, we will just, this will just for free, this will keep getting better. Yeah. Now, coming back to some of the partially solved ones that we talked about earlier and seeing where else we can go with it. So, for example, stereoscopic 3D. Like we said, we are able to trick the eye into thinking it is looking at a detailed 3D environment adequately enough that people can feel immersed in the environment. However, there is a few more improvements that we can do, right? So, one is just the state of the hardware itself, which is you have to worry about things like how much refresh rate do you want to achieve, balance it out with the the size of the battery that will be needed to power it, also the cost of the device itself. And then the next thing would be something about resolution. Like the smaller you make the pixels, the better the overall smoothness of the picture. You don't get that screen door effect. You're not able to see the individual pixels and so on. These are improvements that will be made in just consumer display technology, and we will continue to reap the benefits of it in immersive teaching, immersive learning platforms as well. The other kind of innovation that is happening here is now like quite at the cutting edge of stereoscopic 3D display technologies, right? So, for example, there's something called foveated rendering, which is field of view of the human eye, even though we tend to think of our human field of view as something like 90 degrees or 120 degrees or something, we don't perceive everything in that field of vision at the same level of detail. Instead, whatever is right at the center of what we're looking at, just if you trace a straight line out perpendicular to the eyeball current position, like whatever is there, that is being rendered in that and the region around it is being rendered in a lot of detail, but everything else is sort of blurry and it is okay. So what if we could use the same thing, right? Like if you have an 8K display, there's no need to render the whole thing in 8K. You only need to render what the user is looking at in 8K, and the rest can be, upsampled from maybe even 2K or just full HD or something. And if the brain can't tell the difference, then that is fine. But this will need obviously specialized graphics processors and also very very fast and accurate eye tracking. But there seems to be significant benefits to doing this because once it frees up your graphics processor to do a lot more heavy lifting, and to battery also, which is a big consideration. So this is something that is being actively worked on right now. The next consideration, the next problem to solve is something called focal length. So we all know. So if I look at my hand, place it. If I place my hand close to my face and look at it, I can either see my hand in brilliant detail and the rest of the room behind it as sort of being blurry and out of focus, or I can see the rest of the room completely in focus, at which point my hand would be blurry to me, right? Because I'm trying to make my eyes see objects in my field of view that are at different focal lengths, that are at different distances, and the light coming from them would focus at different points on my retina. So one or the other has to be blurry. Now, this effect doesn't really happen when I'm looking at a 3D environment in a virtual setup, because everything is basically finally going to be pixels on a screen, and that screen is a finite distance away from my face, like 4 inches everywhere. So I don't get this focal length issue at all, even if the items in my virtual scene are at drastically different distances from my eye. So how do we solve this? There are a couple of ways. The one is, if you have really good eye tracking, you could simulate the blurriness, or you could actually have a VR headset set up with multiple focal lengths, screens that are set up at multiple distances, and then you could fake it like that. Or there is another approach that is being used, which is, what if we did away completely with the digital screen itself, and it's just shot light directly into the user's eyes, with this elaborate system of mirrors and so on. This is the light field display technology that companies like Magic Leap are working on, and they have some promising results coming up. Okay, that's all about stereoscopic 3D. The next thing to talk about would be inertial movement systems. Now, this is a very hard problem to solve because, as we know, like the human ear, the inner part of the human ear, the inner part of the cochlea, has certain, it's almost like an inbuilt gyroscope that we have in our body, and the brain processes signals from this inner ear to determine whether we are standing upright, facing sideways, tilting sideways, lying down, and so on, and also to detect whether we are accelerating, turning, changing our speed. Just it's a general purpose gyroscope that we have in our body, and it's hard to fool this thing. Whenever you try to fool this, you start to feel nauseous. Now, what happens is, in VR, you could be your avatar, your character, or persona, whatever, could be accelerating in the virtual space. You could be turning, you could be speeding up, slowing down, you could be falling. Any of these things could be happening, and yet these are only visual and auditory, maybe cues, right? That you're getting from the VR system, but your inner ear is just there. It's rock solid. It's saying you are not moving, and this causes a dissonance, and the brain starts to get nauseous. And this is like 95% of the cases where people get nauseous in a VR system is because of this disconnect. And there are a few ways we can try to solve for this. One of them is through experience design, which is just make sure that the VR experience does not involve acceleration. You can have the user sit in one place, or you can have the user be in constant motion along a straight line, Newton's first law. That is one solution. This is a little bit restrictive on the experienced designers, but that is one way to solve it until we have other more innovative solutions. The second, kind of extreme solution is to actually, well, what if we let the users actually almost move around. So omnidirectional treadmills are being tested out, prototype worked on right now, but it is not very likely that these will, because of their form factor, bulkiness, and cost, and so on. It's not likely this will make it to the everyday house or everyday student, and mostly for games, arcade experiences, and such like. Same also with hydraulic harnesses. These are even bulkier, even bigger. Maybe some other kind of solution might emerge in the future, which is, well, what if we could actually fake the signals that you need to send your inner ear or your brain? Or what if we could actually, or the opposite, what if we could damp those signals? We don't know. This is a solution that will have to be worked upon maybe soon. Maybe it will, or maybe it will just come down to experience design. We don't know. Yeah, the next thing is, now that we have like fairly good head tracking, hand presence, and just overall immersion levels, the a way to take it even to the next step would be to have a full body presence and haptic feedback system. Companies like Tesla Suit and other companies, even Oculus has some products in this that are currently under research and development. Most of these solutions involve lots of little actuation motors, or like electrically actuated uh, liquid substances that can change their hardness and other material properties by electric current, things like this. There's lots of different innovative ways they are approaching this, but yeah, the end product would be some kind of a haptic suit out of science fiction that would give us full body immersion. Do we need so much for immersive education? Probably not. But if the development is going to happen anyway, I'm sure there will be some applications to this that can be used. Yeah, the day is not far off when, this is from a famous book called Ready Player One. There's a movie as well. And it promises an extremely immersive virtual system called the Oasis. And we're not very far from achieving this level of technological progress. Probably the next 10, 15 years, we will be there. What is hard to imagine though is the level of hardware and software penetration that is promised in this movie, right? That might take, and that is still up in the air. We don't know if that will happen. Let's hope so. Okay, so getting started, just switching gears really quick. For getting started with virtual reality development, right? The good thing is it is not that hard. So the most of the hardware resources that we need are quite cheap. Unless you want to go super fancy, then you can buy yourself like a 300, 400, $600 Valve headset, or HTC Vive or so on. But coming down the lower end of the spectrum, even starting as low as like 200, $300, you can get a decent uh, headset. Or even if you just have a Daydream or a Google Cardboard, these are like $5 things. You can even make it yourself, or I think 200, 250 rupees. You can get a Google Cardboard. It's basically just two lenses and a gyroscope. No, actually, no gyroscope because your phone has a gyroscope. It's just two lenses and a magnet for a button, right? Yeah, or you could even just to get started, you can just use the emulator itself that comes accompanying most software development toolkits. So it's quite easy to get started with virtual reality development. And as far as software resources go, VR has been around for like 8 to 10 years, sort of, at this point, and most of the major game engines they already support developing content for AR VR. Now, apart from the major game software engines, there is also SDKs released by the individual AR/VR platforms themselves. But if you want to create like some kind of like a unified experience that you can run on pretty much anything, these are your top three probably game engines: Unity, Unreal, and Godot. Unity uses C Sharp as its primary programming language. It's a very general purpose game engine used by lots of companies. Unreal, very similar to Unity, just uses C++ and has a slightly steeper learning curve. Godot, by the way, Unity and Unreal are both commercial products, and While they're free to use for like research and stuff like that, if you're going to be making money using your products, you'll have to get a license and all that. Godot, on the other hand, is completely open source. It gives you a wide variety of programming languages to choose from. It is slightly newer than the other two. It is slightly less, I would say, full of features than the other two, but it is an option and it is open source, so that is appealing to some people. Anyway, yeah, Unity is my kind of my area of expertise, and if anybody has any questions about using Unity in, as a game engine for VR development, I'd be happy to answer those. I think that is all we have planned for this talk as well. Oh yes, I hope this slideshow is accessible to people who want to take a look at it. And in the appendix, I've just dumped a list of companies or research teams and other teams that are working on AR VR solutions in immersive education. And yeah, there are links to each of these companies in these little cards themselves. If you click on the title, and it's just some companies to watch as they make immersive learning more mainstream. I've also included a list of just a few videos that I personally liked about, and then again a dump of links and some research materials for people that contains material from people who are working in AR VR in education and stuff like that. I think that is all I have for this session as well. Thank you very much for coming. It was a pleasure. Thank you.